HOA knocked down my mountain mansion over fines, and accidentally took out the governor's residence. The morning it happened, the mountain shook with bulldozers, my walls rattled, glass cracked, and the sound of engines filled the valley. I ran outside, thinking it was a mistake, but there they were. The HOA board lined up like generals at war. They didn't just come for me. They came to erase everything I built, and in their hunger for control, they crossed a line no one survives, because the house they demolished that day wasn't just mine. Welcome back to HOA Secrets Uncovered. I'm Daniel. A homeowner tucked deep in the mountain suburbs, I built my dream mansion here. Away from the noise of the city, I work as an architect, designing homes that touch the sky. But I never thought I'd watch my own home, torn down by the very people meant to protect the neighborhood. This is my story. HOA knocked down my mountain mansion over fines, and accidentally took out the governor's residence. The house they demolished that day wasn't just mine. I stood in the cold mountain air, dust on my face, breath burning in my chest. Engines growled below me, a hard metal sound rolling up the slope. The sun was still low, orange on the ridge, sharp on the glass. My hands shook, not from the wind, from something deeper, fear, anger, disbelief. All at once, I had warned them. I had told them this was a line you cannot cross. But the HOA did not listen. They never listened. They only smiled and mailed more letters, with bigger numbers and colder words. I had moved here for peace, to hear the pine trees move like an ocean at night, to watch fog crawl across the valley like a living thing, to build a quiet life with my own two hands. I am an architect. I draw homes that feel like breath, open and light. This house was my proof, my heart set in beams and glass. Your first letter felt silly. Driveway stones not the right shade of gray. Change it once, I laughed. Then I bought a color chart. I wrote a kind reply. The second letter felt petty. Security lights too bright for owls. Replace with approved model. I dimmed the lights. I waited for the owls. I never saw one. The third letter hit hard. Unapproved trees near the boundary. Remove within 7 days or face fines. I looked at the small cedars. I had planted them with my dad's old shovel. I left them in the earth. I could not pull them up. The fines began to stack, week by week, envelope by envelope, numbers that felt unreal at first, then heavy, then cruel. Pay now or lose privileges. Pay now or legal action begins. Pay now or removal of non-compliant structures may occur. Non-compliant structures. They were talking about my home. I tried to set a meeting. I sent emails. I called. I brought cookies to the office. The assistant smiled, said the president was very busy. Next month, maybe. The board met in a room with no windows. They read from papers and rules and more rules. They did not look up when I spoke, when I finished. The president smiled with only her mouth. We appreciate your comments. Expect follow-up. The follow-up was a thicker envelope. Final notice. I drove straight to their office, heart pounding like a drum. Closed for private session. I waited outside the glass door, hands in my jacket, staring at my own reflection. I watched the sky darken, and I felt something darken in me too. I was tired of being small in front of people who built nothing. That night I walked the house from end to end, past the long window where the valley looks like a painting, past the kitchen where I sketched designs on napkins, past the cedar beams that still smelled like rain. I pressed my palms to the walls. I whispered, "You are safe." I meant it. I believed it. But belief is not a bulldozer. Morning came like a siren. Metal tracks bit the gravel road. Orange machines crawled up like insects with steel legs. At the front, the HOA president in a powder blue coat, pearls at her throat, clipboard in hand. The smile again. Behind her, 2 board members, 2 contractors, a man with a camera, a caravan of certainty. I stepped out onto the deck. "You cannot do this." She looked at me like I was late to a meeting. "We have authority." "No, you do not." Her eyes flicked to the clipboard. Multiple violations, unpaid fines, failed remediation, danger to community standards. Community standards. I looked at the trees, the stones, the sky. This was not a community. This was a stage where small people acted big. I told her again, "You are crossing a line you cannot cross." Her pen touched the page. "Begin!" Engines roared. The first machine raised its mouth like a beast. It bit the lower retaining wall. Stone cracked. Sound leaped off the glass and slapped my ears. The deck shivered under my feet. Neighbors gathered along the switchback road, phones up. Whispers like bees. I saw a boy in a red jacket pull his dad's sleeve. "Why are they breaking the mountain house?" His dad shook his head and kept filming. The board member with the camera smiled wider. I ran for my files. Not papers, not letters. Files from a different drawer. Maps. Agreements. A quiet contract that most people never see, months ago. The state approached me. They wanted a private mountain retreat for visiting officials, short stays, secure access, silence guaranteed. I said my house could serve that need, with upgrades, with care. The paperwork was clean. The use was legal. The designation was discreet. The residence. For those who needed quiet work, a single word on the file, executive. I had told the HOA to stop because of that file. I had not said the name. I had not said the title. I only said, "You do not know what you are doing." They thought I was bluffing. They thought I was a man who built a fancy house and wanted special rules. They thought I was weak. Outside, the machine punched through the lower glass wall. It sounded like a wave of ice breaking. Shards skittered across the deck like angry insects. I smelled cedar and dust and the sour scent of hot metal. The second machine gnawed at the beam I oiled by hand last fall. A third pushed at the garden bed until dark soil bled across the stone. The president kept her distance, but I could see her cheeks flush pink in the wind. I dialed the number in the file. Static. A ring. Then a voice I knew from press clips, short words, clipped, focused. I spoke fast, clear. "The HOA has breached." There was a pause. "Say that again." I said it again. Another pause. Then motion, like an order traveling across a wire. "Hold your ground. Help is on the way." I slipped the phone in my pocket. I walked back to the edge of the deck. The board members watched me like hunters watch a deer that has not learned to run. A contractor shouted up the slope, "We will drop the east wall next." The president nodded. "Do it." I looked at the east wall, behind it. The room where my mother slept when she visited, where she left a scarf on a chair and laughed that the mountain stole it. Memory punched me in the ribs. I felt small again. Then I let the feeling pass. I would not break in front of them. Sirens rose from the valley. Not fire, not ambulance, a sound tighter, faster. Black SUVs climbed the road like quiet animals, no flashing lights, just presence. They reached the lower drive and stopped in a neat line. Doors opened in one motion, men and women stepped out, dark coats, steady hands, eyes that scanned and measured. They did not look at the house first, they looked at the people with clipboards. The president drew herself tall. She had practiced this in a mirror. "This is a private community action. You are trespassing." The woman in front did not blink. "Please step back from the machinery." Authority was in her voice like steel inside silk. The contractors froze. Engines idled. Dust hung in the sun like golden smoke. The road filled with quiet. The woman in the coat looked up at me on the deck. "Are you safe?" I nodded. For now, one of the SUVs pulled forward. A man stepped out who did not look like he belonged in an HOA story. His face was on news thumbnails and late-night jokes. He climbed the stairs slow, each step a small earthquake in the crowd. When he reached the deck, he looked at the broken glass, the torn earth, my hand still shaking. He looked at the president. He did not raise his voice.
he did not need to, who authorized the demolition of an executive residence. The president tried to speak. Words tripped and fell out of her mouth. She looked at her clipboard as if it could stop time. This home is in violation of... The man raised a hand. Silence moved across the mountain like a shadow. Neighbors lowered their phones. Contractors killed the engines. Birds returned to the edge of the trees like scouts. The wind pushed dust into the sunlight and turned it bright. I felt the deck steady under my feet. For the first time since dawn, I breathed all the way in. I thought of every letter, every fine, every cold phrase cut and pasted into a threat. I thought of the first night I slept here, the fire in the stone pit, the stars thick as salt in the black bowl of the sky. I thought of the woman in powder blue who decided a home was a problem to solve with teeth and metal. And I understood something simple. Power without care is a wrecking ball. It never builds, it only swings. The man turned to me. "We will handle this. Stand by." I nodded. He walked back down the steps and spoke to the woman in the dark coat. Her team moved like chess. Pieces. Calm. Exact. Cords were pulled from machines. Paperwork was requested and received and set aside like toys. Names were taken, statements recorded. The president tried to stand tall. Her pearls did not shine now. They looked like small white stones pulled from a river. I walked along the deck to the place where the glass had fallen. I looked out over the valley. The fog was lifting. The town down there did not know what just happened up here. But they would. Because news climbs faster than any SUV. Because people love a story about small rules breaking big thrones. Because this is not only my house, it is a mirror for everyone who has been fined for the wrong shade of a life. I turned back to the road. The boy in the red jacket watched me from behind his dad. I gave him a little wave. He waved back. His dad lowered the phone and looked at me with a mix of sorry and thrill. We are all witnesses when power forgets its place. The woman in the dark coat approached the president again. "Your authority ended the moment you crossed that gate. You will cease all activity. You will remain available for questioning." The president opened her mouth. No words came. Only a thin sound like a string pulled too tight. I felt my legs bring me down the steps. I stood on the gravel between the machines and the board. I spoke soft. "End this now. Go home." The board member with the camera blinked. He looked at the SUVs. He looked at the broken wall. He lowered his lens. Silence wrapped the mountain. Only wind in the pines. Only the click of a cooling engine. Only my heart slowing to a beat I recognized as mine. I knew this was not over. There would be hearings, there would be papers and press and people who suddenly wanted to help. There would be a price for what they had done. But right now there was a pause. A deep breath between two storms. The mountain was still quiet when the machines rolled back down the gravel road. Their treads left scars in the earth. Black lines across my driveway like fresh wounds. The SUVs stayed. Black and heavy, waiting for the word that would decide the fate of everyone standing here. The president no longer looked like a queen. She looked like a statue cracking in the sun. Her clipboard pressed tight to her chest, as if the paper inside could erase the glass and cedar scattered around us. I stood in the rubble of my mansion, my shoes crunching on broken windows that once looked out over the valley. Each step hurt. Not from glass, but from memory. That wall had framed every sunrise I watched with coffee in my hand. That beam still smelled of the cedar oil I rubbed in with my father's old rag. That garden bed had been dug by hand. Every stone placed in silence under the sound of owls. Now it was all noise. Ripped down in minutes by people who never built anything. The governor's team moved with calm precision. One spoke into a radio. Another paced the perimeter with steady eyes. No panic, only control. The board members shifted uncomfortably. No longer bold. The man with the camera had stopped recording. Now he held his lens down at his side, like a weapon he no longer dared to use. The contractors whispered, "Should we leave? Will we be paid?" The air was colder now, sharper. Fear had a taste. And it was in every breath. I thought of how quickly power can turn. Yesterday these people fined me for planting the wrong tree. Today they trembled because they had uprooted the wrong life. They believed the HOA was untouchable, but no one is untouchable. Not when they swing too wildly. Not when they forget the weight of their own hand. The governor himself stayed quiet, standing near his SUV, hands behind his back. His presence. It was enough. Even the wind seemed to pause around him. He glanced at me once, not long, just enough for me to understand. This was no longer just about my house. This was about something bigger, something the HOA could not even spell on their endless letters. The president tried again. Her voice cracked, but she forced the words, "This property is in violation. This resident has ignored." The woman in the dark coat stepped forward, her shadow falling over the president's neat shoes. "This property is an executive residence under state lease. You have committed unlawful demolition. Further speech is not advised." The president's pearls rattled against each other. Her lips trembled, but no words came. Her clipboard lowered, then slipped from her hand. Papers scattered across the gravel like white leaves in the wind. I bent to pick one up. It was a violation notice. Bold red letters stamped across my name. The words felt cheap now. Paper shields against steel truth. I looked at her and felt no pity. I thought of the nights I opened those letters and felt my stomach twist. The days I worked double hours to cover fines that grew like weeds. The shame they tried to build around me. Now that shame had found its way back to their own doorstep, neighbors still lined the road. Some whispered to each other. Some filmed. Some just stared. I could feel their confusion. Were they safe? Or were they next? Because if the HOA could demolish a governor's house by mistake, what chance did anyone else have? The woman in the dark coat gestured toward me. "Tell us everything you have received from the HOA." I walked into what remained of my living room. Papers still lay on the counter. Envelopes unopened. I gathered them. Stacks thick enough to build their own wall. I carried them outside and dropped them on the gravel between us. "This is what they called justice." The governor finally spoke. His voice was calm, but it cut like stone through water. "These boards were built to protect neighborhoods, not terrorize them. When they forget that, they must answer." He turned his gaze on the president. "You will answer." Her knees shook. She clutched the air as if reaching for rules that had always saved her before. But rules cannot save you when you are the one breaking them. The team began to document the damage. Photos of the broken glass. Measurements of the destroyed beams. Notes on the machines still parked like beasts caught mid-meal. Each click of a camera was another nail in the coffin of the HOA. I knew this was only the beginning. Lawyers would come, courts would follow, and every letter they ever sent me would now be used as evidence of obsession turned into destruction. I looked again at my house, half standing, half memory, and I felt something sharp inside me. It was not only loss, it was hunger, not for revenge, but for balance. For once, the scales were finally tipping toward those who built instead of those who only judged. The governor's eyes met mine again. "You will be compensated." But money was never the point. I wanted my home, my peace, my mountain mornings. Those cannot be rebuilt with a check. Still, I nodded, because sometimes survival is enough to begin with. The board members whispered among themselves. One muttered about resigning. Another asked if they could leave. The woman in the dark coat shook her head. "You stay. Every action here is recorded. Every face accounted for." The president sat down on a folding chair one of the contractors had left behind. Her hands clutched her pearls so tight I thought they would snap. She no longer looked like a ruler. She looked like what she always was, a person who mistook paper for power. The valley wind shifted. Carrying the smell of pine and broken earth, I breathed deep, steady now, and realized something. This fight was never really about my mansion. It was out the illusion of control. The HOA thought they controlled the mountain, but the mountain belonged to itself, and no paper, no fine, no letter could ever change that. Still, there was one question burning in me. One I could not shake as I looked at the crowd. The rubble. The ruined pride of the board. Why do people who build nothing always believe they have the right to destroy everything? The valley did not sleep that night, even after the machines had gone silent, even after the SUVs rolled away with their dark-coated guards. The mountains still hummed with the echo of what had happened. My mansion was no longer whole. It stood like a skeleton against the moonlight, every window broken, every wall trembling as if it knew tomorrow might not come. I sat on the deck. What was left of it? Splinters around my boots and ash in my throat. Neighbors had gone home. Whispers carried down the road like smoke. Some felt pity, some felt fear, and some felt joy in secret, because when one man falls to the HOA, the others think they are safe for a little while. I held the stack of violation letters in my lap, pages creased with anger. Ink faded from too many nights of rereading. Each one was a memory of humiliation. You planted without approval. You painted without notice. You hosted without permission. Rules that made life smaller, tighter, colder. Rules that turned a dream into a prison. I thought back to the first board meeting I ever attended. They sat at a long table, heads high, eyes sharp, not neighbors, not friends, but rulers. The president in her pearl necklace read violations like scripture. One board member smiled every time she said the word fine. Another scribbled notes like he was writing laws for a nation. Not one of them had lifted a hammer, or planted a tree, or drawn a plan for a home, and yet they believed they owned us all when I refused to pay. Their smiles grew colder. They saw me not as a neighbor, but as a threat, and threats must be erased. That is what led us here. That is what brought bulldozers to my door. But what they never saw, what they never understood, was that I was not alone. The state file in my drawer was not just paper. It was protection. It was truth. And now, it was a weapon against their greed. The governor's team promised hearings. They promised justice. But promises are slow, and the HOA moves fast. I knew they would not stop with one mistake. They would try to cover it. They would try to twist it. They would try to paint me as the villain, and if I let them, they would win again. So I began to prepare. I documented every wall, every broken window, every stone they had shifted. I photographed the rubble until my camera cried for memory. I printed copies of every letter. I highlighted every absurd phrase, excessive foliage, improper shade variants, unauthorized birdhouse installation. These were the crimes they said justified destruction. I stacked them high in a box marked evidence. The mountain was quiet except for owls. Their calls felt like warnings. Or maybe blessings. I whispered to the darkness that I would not bend. Not again. Not ever. The next morning I drove into town. Faces turned as I passed. Whispers followed me through the store, through the diner, through the post office. Some shook my hand and said, "Stay strong." Others muttered that I had brought this on myself. But all of them leaned closer when I spoke. All of them wanted to know one thing. What happens next? I didn't answer, because the truth was, I didn't know. Would the governor's power crush them? Or would the HOA find a way to twist even this into their game? All I knew was that the fight had only begun. That night, I heard footsteps on my driveway. I stepped out with a flashlight. A neighbor stood there. Mrs. Allen, an old woman with silver hair and kind eyes. She held a folder in her hands. "I thought you should see this," she whispered. Inside were copies of her own violation letters. They had fined her for her mailbox, for her shutters, for the bird bath her husband built before he passed. Tears touched her eyes as she spoke. "I paid until I couldn't. Then they threatened me with foreclosure. I was too scared to fight alone. But you are not alone anymore." One by one more neighbors came, each with papers, each with stories. A fence too tall, a door too bright, a laugh too loud at a family barbecue. It became clear the HOA was not protecting the community.
It was feeding on it. I sat with them around my broken fire pit. We shared coffee and stories and anger, and for the first time, I felt less like a victim and more like part of something greater. This was not just my battle. This was everyone's. By dawn we had made a quiet vow. We would gather every story. We would collect every letter. We would build a mountain of evidence taller than the one we lived on, and when the time came, we would bring it all to light. The president did not know yet. The board did not see yet. But their empire of paper was about to burn in the fire of truth. I looked at the ruins of my mansion, the cedar beams still strong despite the wounds, and I felt something I had not felt in weeks, hope. Hope that justice was possible, hope that neighbors could rise when one house fell. But I also knew this mountain was not finished testing us. The HOA would not go quietly. They would claw and scratch and lie until the very end. And when people desperate to keep power feel it slipping away, they are capable of anything. The first sign of the board's desperation came sooner than I expected. 2 days after the mountain shook. 2 days after the governor's people left. A letter appeared in my mailbox. No stamp, no postmark. Just slid inside by a hand that didn't want to be seen. The envelope was thin, but heavy with malice. Inside, bold black letters screamed across the page. Cease spreading misinformation. Failure to comply will result in legal action against you. I laughed when I read it, but my laugh was bitter. They had knocked down my walls, shattered my windows, exposed their own corruption to the entire town, and yet they still believed a letter could silence me. The arrogance of people who think paper is stronger than truth. That night I sat at my broken dining table. Half the roof was gone. Stars flickered above me through the cracks. I laid out the letters from the neighbors, dozens of them now, stacks growing higher by the hour, every story worse than the last. One family fined for letting their daughter chalk the driveway. Another threatened for planting sunflowers that grew an inch too tall. And Mrs. Allen, the old woman with silver hair, she confessed the HOA had tried to push her out entirely so they could resell her house to someone who would respect community standards. Community standards. I spat the words into the night air. Nothing about this was community. It was a cartel of power. Dressed in the clothes of neighbors, I knew the next board meeting would be chaos. The governor's people had promised oversight, but oversight moves slow. The board still had time to twist, to manipulate, to scare people back into silence. So I made a choice. I would not just show up at the meeting. I would bring every voice the HOA had tried to bury. The day came fast. The meeting hall was a small building near the base of the mountain. Fluorescent lights buzzed above cheap folding chairs. Usually only a handful of people came, but tonight, the room overflowed. Dozens stood shoulder to shoulder, holding their own letters, their own fines, their own anger. The board sat stiff at the front table. The president wore her pearls again, but her smile was gone. Her eyes darted from the crowd to the circuits. Cameras now stationed in the corners. News crews had come. This was no longer a quiet neighborhood squabble. This was a story. The president tapped her gavel. Order, order, please. But her voice trembled, and no one listened. I stood up, letters in my hand. My voice was steady, louder than I thought it could be. We all know why we're here. We have been fined for flowers, for fences, for birdhouses and chalk drawings. We have been threatened, bullied, humiliated. And now, they destroyed a house that wasn't even theirs to touch, a house that belonged to the state itself. Gasps rippled through the room. Cameras clicked. The board members shifted in their chairs like children caught cheating on a test. I read the letters aloud one by one, every violation more absurd than the last. The crowd groaned, laughed bitterly, shook their heads. By the 10th letter, the room was boiling with anger. By the 20th, the board's faces were pale.
The president tried to interrupt. These are exaggerations, fabrications. But her words were drowned by the sound of voices rising against her. For the first time, the fear had shifted sides. The governor's liaison entered quietly through the back. The woman in the dark coat from the mountain stood near the wall, watching, listening. She did not need to speak. Her presence was enough to remind everyone that power now had a new balance. I ended my speech with the final letter, my own, the notice that declared my entire home a non-compliant structure. The letter that gave them permission, in their minds, to destroy everything I had built. I held it up for the cameras, for the neighbors, for the governor's people, and I let it fall to the floor. Silence hung heavy. Every eye in the room turned to the president. For once, she had no script to follow. Her pearls gleamed under the harsh light. Her lips pressed tight. Her hands clenched the gavel so hard. Her knuckles whitened. Finally, she spoke, her voice brittle. We were only enforcing rules, without rules. There is chaos. I took a step forward. Rules are not the problem. The problem is when rules become weapons. Applause erupted. The sound shook the hall harder than any gavel. The president flinched. The board slumped back in their chairs, and I knew something had changed forever that night. As the crowd spilled into the parking lot under the cold mountain sky, I felt lighter. The fear that had pressed on me for months had lifted. We were no longer alone. We were no longer silent. We were no longer afraid. But victory is never clean. I could see it in the president's eyes as she left the hall. She was not finished. The board was wounded, but not gone. And people who fear losing power often fight hardest in the dark, back at my ruined mansion. I stood on the deck and watched the valley lights below. The air was calm, but my thoughts were storming. Would the HOA collapse under its own corruption, or would it rise again, sharper, more dangerous? The fight was far from over. The night after the meeting, the mountain felt different. The air was sharper, the silence deeper. It was the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from waiting. Waiting for the next move. Waiting for the strike that always follows when power feels cornered. I sat among the ruins of my mansion, the cedar beams rising like broken ribs around me. The stars shone through gaps where the roof once stood. It should have felt hopeless, but instead, I felt stronger. Because for the first time, the HOA had been forced into the light. Their power no longer lived in whispers and sealed envelopes. Now the whole town knew. The cameras knew. The state knew, and they hated me for it. I knew they wouldn't stop. People like that never stop. They don't know how. They mistake control for survival, and when control slips from their hands, they will claw until their fingers bleed just to get it back. The proof came with a knock at midnight, a heavy fist against my broken door. I rose fast. My heart already raced. Two men stood outside, not contractors, not neighbors, but strangers, suits too neat for this mountain, smiles too sharp. They claimed to be legal representatives of the HOA. They handed me a packet thick with papers, inside, pages of accusations, defamation, public disturbance, incitement against community governance. They were suing me. I almost laughed. They had destroyed my home, humiliated themselves before the governor, and still they believed they could bury me in paper. But my laughter froze when I turned to the last page, a demand for immediate payment, an amount so high it looked like a joke, more than the house itself. They wanted to bankrupt me into silence. I tore the papers in half and threw them into the night wind. The men frowned, but said nothing. They left as quietly as they came, but their message stayed. The HOA would not go down without trying to take me with them. The next morning neighbors returned. Word had spread about the midnight delivery. Mrs. Allen brought coffee, her hands trembling as she poured. "They're trying to scare you," she whispered. I nodded. "I know, but they won't succeed." One by one, more neighbors arrived, each with stories, each with letters, each ready to stand beside me. The fight was no longer mine alone. It had become a movement. By afternoon, we gathered at the ruins of my mansion. We laid the violation letters in piles. Like evidence at a trial, we spoke of our stories, our fears, our anger. And then, something unexpected happened. We began to laugh, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity was finally too heavy to cry over. Fined for flowers, fined for mailboxes, fined for birdhouses and chalk drawings. It was madness. And yet it was our shared madness. We made a plan. We would take everything to the press, not just the governor's office, not just the courts, but to the people beyond our valley. We would tell the world. What happens when neighbors turn into tyrants behind the shield of community standards? The board must have heard whispers of our plan because that evening, new signs appeared around the neighborhood, bold red letters nailed to trees and posts. Community in crisis. Beware false narratives. They painted me as a liar, a dangerous man spreading unrest. They called my neighbors misguided sheep. They even claimed the governor's involvement was exaggerated. But lies cannot survive once truth has a taste. And our truth was everywhere. Photos of my broken house, stacks of letters, testimonies on camera. The story spread faster than the board could stop it. By the end of the week, reporters filled the mountain roads, microphones in faces, questions fired like arrows. The president tried to speak once, pearls at her throat, but her voice cracked under the weight of cameras. She fled inside her home and shut the door. The image went viral. The Queen of Fines hiding from her own kingdom. I should have felt victorious. But part of me still ached. My mansion was gone. My life cracked open, even if justice came. Nothing would replace the mornings I once had, the quiet I once owned. Justice does not rebuild walls. It only balances scales. Still, hope grew around me. Neighbors who once stayed silent now stood tall. People who once feared fines now shouted their stories to anyone who would listen. The mountain was no longer quiet with fear. It was alive with rebellion. But I knew the board still had cards to play. Desperate people always do. Would they retreat and resign quietly? Or would they lash out harder, dragging the whole community down with them? The governor's liaison returned to my ruins one evening. She stood among the broken beams, her coat brushing the dust. She spoke softly. This is not just a neighborhood issue anymore. It is a matter of law and order and power abused. She promised hearings, investigations, reforms. She promised the board would face consequences, but promises. I had learned. Take time, and time is the weapon of those who cling to power. I stood under the broken sky that night. The stars felt closer than ever. The mountain hummed with the sound of a fight not yet finished. And I asked myself a question I could not yet answer. How far am I willing to go to see this through? The storm truly broke the morning of the hearing. The sky was gray and heavy, clouds pressing low against the mountain. It felt like even the weather knew something was about to snap. The county courthouse stood at the bottom of the valley, a building of old stone and glass that looked both tired and eternal. I walked up its steps with the weight of my ruined mansion still on my shoulders. Behind me came my neighbors, dozens of them now, some holding folders stuffed with violation letters, others carrying nothing but the scars of years living under the HOA's rule. We were not silent. Our footsteps echoed. Our voices hummed. And for the first time the board would face us in a place where they could not hide behind clipboards and gavel taps. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with reporters. Cameras lined the walls like watchful eyes. The board sat stiff at a long table, their president front and center, pearls tight around her neck like a chain. Her face was pale, but her chin high. The kind of defiance that only grows when someone believes their power can still protect them. The judge entered, robes flowing like storm clouds. Silence fell, and the fight began. The HOA's lawyer spoke first. His words were smooth, practiced. filled with legal smoke. He painted me as reckless, defiant, a man who thought himself above the rules. He said the HOA acted within authority, that my house was a violation, that my refusal to comply left them no choice. Every sentence twisted the truth until it looked like order. Every phrase tried to turn destruction into responsibility. I clenched my fists under the table. I wanted to shout, but I held my silence because I knew my turn would come when it did. I rose slowly. Carrying a box filled with papers, I set it on the table with a sound that echoed through the room, the sound of weight, the sound of truth. "These," I said, pulling out letter after letter, "are the rules they used to break us." I read them aloud. Fined for the wrong shade of stones. Fined for birdhouses not on the approved list. Fined for letting children play too loudly on a summer afternoon. The room shifted. Reporters scribbled faster. Gasps whispered from the benches. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Then I told them what happened to my mansion. I described the machines, the glass shattering, the cedar beams falling. I described the president standing there, clipboard in hand, ordering the destruction as if she were tearing up weeds. And then I revealed the truth that silenced the entire room. It wasn't only my house. It was also an executive residence under state lease, and when they destroyed it, they didn't just destroy my dream, they destroyed property protected by the governor himself. The president stiffened, but her eyes betrayed the fear. The liaison from the governor's office confirmed every word. The courtroom buzzed like a hive struck with a stick. The judge raised a hand. Order, order in this court. But there was no order left for the board. Their paper kingdom was crumbling under the weight of truth. Neighbors stood one by one. Each told their story. Fined for flowers, threatened for shutters, bullied for paint colors and lawn lengths. The judge listened, his face grave. Every story was another stone dropped into the scales, and those scales were tipping fast. The president tried once more to defend herself. Without rules, there is chaos. Her voice cracked. The judge's reply was ice. Rules are not weapons, and you have used them as such. The gavel struck like thunder. The HOA was stripped of authority pending full investigation. The board members were ordered to surrender documents. The president's pearls shook against her throat as if they wanted to break free outside the courthouse. Cameras swarmed. Neighbors cheered, hugged, cried. It felt like a victory. But I knew better, because a wounded enemy is still dangerous, and the HOA was wounded now. Badly. That night I returned to my broken mansion. The valley was quiet again, but my mind was loud. I thought of the board members sitting in their big houses, plotting in the dark, desperate to claw back what they had lost. I thought of the neighbors who had finally found courage, their hope now tied to my fight, and I thought of myself, a man who wanted only peace, now turned into a soldier against corruption. The fire pit still stood among the rubble. I lit it, flames rising against the night. Neighbors gathered once more, their faces lit by orange glow. We spoke not of fear this time, but of rebuilding homes, rebuilding trust, rebuilding a community without chains disguised as rules. And as the flames cracked in the mountain air, I realized something. This was bigger than a mansion, bigger than fines. This was about freedom, the kind that begins at your own doorstep and grows into the world around you. The board might still scheme, they might still strike, but the people were awake now, and once people wake up, they do not fall back asleep. The mountain never forgets. That's what my father used to say when we hiked these trails, when we planted cedar saplings on the ridge, when we built fires that sent sparks into the dark sky. And as I stood among the ruins of my mansion after the hearing, I realized he was right. The mountain had watched everything. The laughter when I first moved in, the fear when the letters came, the roar when the bulldozers tore it all apart, and now the mountain was watching what would come next. The HOA was broken, at least on the surface. The judge had stripped their authority. The governor's people had their eyes on every move. Neighbors no longer feared them. And yet, I knew it wasn't over. Power doesn't vanish overnight. It lingers like smoke after a fire, choking those who breathe too deep. I spent the first nights after the ruling walking through my wrecked home. The east wall was gone, the garden bed destroyed, beams bent like broken arms, but the foundation was still there, strong, unyielding. Just like me, I ran my hands over the stone, rough but steady, and I thought, maybe this was never the end. Maybe this was the beginning. Neighbors kept visiting. They brought food, blankets, even tools, not to rebuild yet, but to remind me I wasn't alone. We sat on folding chairs under the open sky. We shared stories of lives lived under rules too small for the human spirit. Every laugh felt like rebellion. Every plan felt like freedom. The board members vanished from public. The president locked herself inside her pristine house. Blinds drawn tight, pearls hidden away. But whispers spread that they were hiring new lawyers, that they were trying to shift blame onto contractors, that they wanted to rise again, leaner, meaner, hungrier for power. I didn't doubt it, because people who taste control never let it go willingly. The governor's liaison visited me once more. She stood where my living room used to be, notebook in hand, eyes steady. "Change is coming," she said softly. "But change is slow. You must decide whether to wait for it, or to build it yourself." Her words burned in me all night. Wait, or build, silence, or voice, fear, or defiance. The next morning, I made my choice. I gathered every neighbor who would stand with me. We met not in the HOA office, not in their hall of rules, but right there on the mountain, where the air was clear and the sky endless. We spoke of a new beginning, not an HOA built on control, but a community built on respect, where rules meant safety, not punishment, where neighbors protected each other, not preyed on each other. Hands rose in agreement, voices echoed in unity, and for the first time, the mountain did not feel heavy with fear. It felt alive with possibility. I walked back to the ruins alone after the meeting. The sun dipped low, painting the valley gold. Shadows stretched across the broken beams, and I smiled, not because the house was gone, but because I knew what would rise again, stronger, freer, untouchable. I looked out over the valley, lights twinkling like stars that had fallen into the earth. The same valley where bulldozers once roared, now quiet. The same neighbors who once whispered, now shouting together, and I understood. The HOA had demolished my mansion, but in doing so, they had built something bigger than any home. They had built unity, they had built courage, they had built the end of their own empire. The mountain never forgets. It never forgives either. And the story of what they did here would live longer than any rulebook. I bent down, picked up a shard of glass from my broken window. I held it to the fading light. It caught the sun like fire, and I promised myself, this piece of ruin would not be the last word. It would be the first brick of something new. Justice had begun, but it was not finished, and I knew there would be battles ahead. But I was no longer afraid, because I had learned the truth. They could break walls, they could scatter beams, but they could not destroy a spirit that refuses to bow.